A very warm welcome to everyone this evening to this second in the series on energizing agriculture in the Global South. My name is Richard Harrison. I'm the CEO of Smart Power Myanmar, and I'm delighted to see so many people join us this evening for this session on delivering energy access. We've had a session last week where we focused on value chains as the engine of economic growth, and today we're going to be moving that discussion forward by talking about how do we actually identify and then move forward with the problem of delivering on high value ag energy opportunities when they do arise. So I'm just going to start very briefly by outlining the genesis of this initiative, of this series of discussions on energizing agriculture. And for those who are joining for the second time, I apologize if there's some slight repetition here, but I think for new participants, it's just worth providing a short overview of why we're doing this and what the rationale is. I think, first of all, the logic of what we're doing here is, I think, addressing a question which is in many people's minds, which is how do we leverage complementary investments in agriculture and electricity that can yield potentially huge dividends in terms of poverty alleviation. But this also comes with this realization that it's not just about the link between agriculture and energy and poverty alleviation. This is actually critical for business models to be effective for the entire distributed rural electrification push, which we see a lot more force behind and I think is going to take shape over the next several years. Secondly, we're trying to address a question which we're all grappling with, and we've certainly been grappling with this in Southeast Asia, which is how to identify, establish, and grow commercially attractive rural customers. In Myanmar, this has been an extremely difficult challenge because you're dealing with a highly agrarian society, which faces considerable problems in terms of agricultural investment and lifting up from a very low base. However, this also makes Myanmar an excellent case study for this type of research, which we hope is useful not just for Southeast Asia, but for the whole Global South, which is why we wanted to open up this discussion to a broader community. Thirdly, this study was born from a conviction that while electrification planners, decision makers, and funders are really starting to gear up investment in distributed rural electrification initiatives, we also come at this from a standpoint of having been both on that side of the fence, but also in implementation side of on the implementation side of the fence, and trying to grapple with real mini grids or real other distributed rural electrification initiatives on the ground, and then trying to put those into motion using resources that are available, and coming to the realization that whilst the supply side has been relatively well financed up until now, for at least at the experimental level in some countries, well beyond that, what's really been missing from this, what we call the missing middle, is any real investment in value chains and the agricultural components of those very same projects. And so going to scale in this context makes it extraordinarily difficult to see how, without looking at a complementary set of programs and initiatives, you're really going to create replicable business models that investors will take a shine to and get excited over. In Myanmar, this became really strongly put in focus for us when about 2 years ago, which is roughly when we conceptualized this study, we started trying to understand how to pull this landscape together on the supply side and the demand side. We went to government departments to understand how they were thinking about agriculture and energy, to discover that they really weren't, that there was agriculture was over there in a totally different ministry from where electrification was being planned. And there was really almost no communication at all between the off-grid energy planners and the agricultural initiatives that were taking place. We would spend a lot of time with multilateral donors who were putting hundreds of millions of dollars in agriculture and value chains, but not $1 of which was being twinned with any electrification program. And this, for us, was a real epiphany. It was, how could hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, potentially in the billions of dollars in one country, be being deployed in such important areas, but there was no connection between them at all. And so for us, we asked that question, well, why would that be? The answer came back, well, we don't do energy, or we don't do agriculture. And we said, well, actually, you all do, and you should be thinking about those things. What are you lacking? And I think information was what people lacked. Those people focused on energy really didn't understand what we were talking about when we were trying to talk about the value chain. And so we decided, and with our fantastic partners, TFE Energy, to do a study that would try to uncover this and help us understand this for our own country. But the results of this and the findings that we identified as a result of this work really got a lot of interest from a lot of different players around the world. And so we were encouraged to try to share in a more broad way. And we hope that you find this of interest, and we hope that you find it relevant. Last week's session, we had 4 fantastic speakers from PRIO, from Energrow, from the Rockefeller Foundation in Nairobi, and from Aquafarms Africa. John Lane, Aaron Leopold, Chianda Njogu, and Wiata Thomas talked about their various initiatives and their plans for the future. And it was really extremely interesting to hear such diverse initiatives taking place, but everyone was identifying the same problems. We need people who are willing and able to pay for electricity, and they also need to be able to invest in their micro businesses at the same time to make this work. And today's session, we're absolutely delighted to have Mohammed Jibril from the Rural Energy Agency of Nigeria with us, and Alastair Smith, co-founder of PowerGen, and Samit Mitra from Smart Power India, who've been doing fantastic things across Eastern India in recent years. Your MC this evening is going to be Sam Dubey, who is the lead author of Energizing Agriculture, the study that we've done together, and he's going to lead the sessions with the speakers, and then hopefully we'll have time for some question and answer at the end. We are going to be very respectful of your time. We won't go over 1 hour. If we do have questions, we will be documenting those and answering them through social media and through emails separately if we do run out of time. So with that, and with special thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation for their support for these events, I'd like to hand over to you, Sam.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. And just a couple of housekeeping bits. First of all, this session is being recorded. And also, as Richard mentions, if you do have any questions, please put them into the chat box for this Zoom call. If we do have some time at the end of the session, we will address them in the call. But if we don't, as Richard said, we'll be following on from them after the call. Now, we're going to be quite strict with the timings. We appreciate and value everyone's time. So we're going to be sticking to the hour as closely as we can. So Richard mentioned the siloing between agricultural decision-making and energy decision-making and strategy. And I think this is such a critical point. And it's one of the major reasons why I think that embracing the subject of enabling environments and in turn business model innovation and delivery model innovation is so critical. Now, when I think of enabling environments, I think of a very complex, multivariate space with lots of different stakeholders, lots of different agendas, and lots of different subsets of enabling environments that are operating on different scales. What is a perfect enabling environment for one stakeholder is not necessarily the perfect enabling environment for another stakeholder. There are overlaps and there are places where they don't mix. Now, the mini-grid industry is quite unusual in that it involves such a wide variety of stakeholders. And it's a very complex challenge. In one sense, you're trying to achieve what is arguably a social good, that of universal electrification. And like many social goods, there's a very strong argument that it should not nor cannot be profit-making. Rather, it's something that national governments need to invest in for the benefit of the populace. Yet, in the mini-grid industry, more often than not, it is private for-profit companies that are actualizing these connections. And so there's a direct conflict there. And that's where subsidies, tariff buy-downs, results-based financing, and all of these other mechanisms come in, essentially to incentivize these for-profit companies to carry out the task of universal electrification. Now, already there, you have some very interesting stakeholders and some very interesting dynamics at play. You have the national governments who have a mandate for electrification and often are campaigning on the promise to plug people in. You have the private companies who are delivering the connections. And of course, you have the people on the ground, the end recipients of these services. So let's talk about the government stakeholder role here, first of all, because it's arguably the easiest to understand. The role of government is to create a national scale enabling environment conducive to connections being made. And their primary tools are policy and regulation. Now you have countries where a mini-grid industry, for example, will flourish because of an utter lack of regulation, such as Somalia. You'll get countries that will flourish because of very progressive and mini-grid friendly policies, such as Nigeria, and we'll hear about that in a minute. And you get some countries where by the single stroke of a pen, what was once a flourishing mini-grid sector ceases to be, as happened in Tanzania with the introduction of the single national tariff. Now, as anyone who has actually tried to build a commercially viable mini-grid in these kind of conditions will tell you, the process of building a mini-grid is a fantastically complex one, involving the balancing of any subsidies that might be available with the inherent commercial viability of a site. The enabling environment will be a function of how many connections will be served, what the energy demand will be, what the tariff is, what it will cost to run lines and provide smart meters to each of these endpoints, and importantly, what the mix of commercial to non-commercial customers will be. So we've talked about this in some of the other sessions, noticeably the first session about the role that commercial users play to the viability and commercial prospects of a renewable energy project. And so it's a complex balancing of all of these different things which determines whether a project developer will choose to develop a site or not. Now, I say it's a complex assessment, but all too often, mini-grids are built without a thorough enough assessment of this and therefore fail to ever be profitable. So I would not be doing my job if I did not point out that this is exactly what the SPM report that we're launching is attempting to do. Among other things, it tries to lay out a framework whereby these dynamics can be mapped and evaluated in order to focus on the ones that have the greatest potential, whether that potential be about improved farmer livelihoods or strong returns on investment into captive power renewable energy projects. Now, there are a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account too. For example, how sure are we that the regulation is not going to change? All sorts of sovereign risks need to be taken into account. Minimizing these is often the role of governments and large donors. Less risk creates an enabling environment for investors. Now, we'll be touching on this more in the next session where we talk about the investor story. For now, let's talk about the productive user story, because this is where the interests of the mini-grid developer and the communities being electrified overlap. It's also, in our humble opinion, the leverage point that can be utilized to scale up mini-grid businesses sustainably. So we've seen how an enabling environment from the perspective of a mini-grid developer is a function of upstream dynamics like regulation, as well as downstream dynamics, such as the scale of energy demand from entrepreneurs in a community. But the same is true for these entrepreneurs. They are also exposed to upstream and downstream dynamics and limitations. And this concept is a major point of difference between the canon of writing on productive uses of energy and the SPM report. We've really tried to articulate that the productive user cannot and should not be isolated and simplified. They're a node of a much larger system. Let's take, for example, a rice thresher in a newly electrified village. Their business depends on an enabling environment in which there is enough paddy to thresh on the one hand, and there is now enough demand for the now threshed rice on the other. One of the key points to come out of the report is that the value of increased productivity, for example, increased yields of paddy that come out as a result of improved irrigation techniques, can only be realized if the surplus rice can be sold into downstream markets. It's not isolated to the dynamics within a single village itself. And this is a point of departure that this report really tried to hammer home. Therefore, any assessment of the viability of a rice threshing business has to explore and quantify these wider upstream and downstream value chain dynamics. Now, this enabling environment has less to do with national energy policy and a lot to do with national agricultural policy. For many decades, agricultural development has involved increasing yields, the upstream inputs, and developing markets, the downstream outputs. And it's largely assumed that raw produce will travel from rural areas to peri-urban areas with electricity in order to be processed. Now, however, all of that's changing, and the conventions of value chain analysis need a good shake-up. For the first time ever, solutions exist to bring affordable, sustainable, decentralized energy into under-electrified areas. And this means that entire value chains can be reshaped, and crucially, much of the value derived from processing agricultural output can be shifted into rural off-grid areas. Now, the importance of this to rural development cannot be overstated. And this is why we're adding our voice to the growing cry that the walls between the departments of national energy policy and agricultural strategy need to be broken down, and these conversations need to be had together. Put very simply, access to energy creates an enabling environment for agriculture, and agriculture creates an enabling environment for energy access delivery models. It's really as simple as that. So this segues actually very nicely with our first guest on the panel today. We're lucky enough to have Mohammed from the Rural Electrification Agency of Nigeria here. Now, the Rural Electrification Agency, for those that don't know it, is generally considered to be one of the most progressive government agencies in the world with regards to mini-grids and decentralized innovation. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Mohammed, about these enabling environments at the very broadest scale, about creating sort of national level conditions for a mini-grid industry to flourish. So perhaps you could spend a moment or two and tell us about some of the initiatives that you've applied in Nigeria that have proven to be quite successful and led to this flourishing of a mini-grid industry. Mohammed, if you're ready, over to you.
Yeah, hi, again, my name is Mohammed Jibril. I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm? You can hear me? All right, that's good. So yes, REA, Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, is tasked with providing electricity for unserved and underserved areas, with more emphasis on unserved areas. That's where you find rural communities that have spent decades and centuries without any trace of electricity within them. And what usually find is people have started to develop that kind of resistance to change, and it would be difficult to just go to them and talk about bringing electricity. But what REA does is starting this by engaging with them, carrying out stakeholder conversations, enlightening them on the benefits that they would have with electricity. But going back to the question of regulations, I think one of the key things we've done to provide that enabling environment for mini-grid deployment is that regulation. First of all, it allows for private sector participation within the sector. initially what you usually see is government doing capital projects, deploying mini grids, and then they come in to have sustainability problems, lack of ownership, and they become dilapidated, the components become stolen, and things like that. So it allows for private sector to come and partner with government agencies to deploy mini grids. And then secondly, it defines capacity, and it brings licensing. It brings in the public sector to regulate, to say that you can't do 1 megawatt without the government giving you a license and to supervise the deployment, the standardization of the equipments you bring. And it also dictates what happens when the grid comes. It's one thing to focus on the off-grid sector and take these small off-grid systems isolated from the national grid, but what happens when the grid expands and reaches to that area where the mini grids are. So all these things are regulations that the government put in place to make sure that the private sector would come in and put in their investment and also recoup some of these investments back. And we can also talk about the grants and loans like Richard said in the beginning, that provide subsidy and ease that risk that developer faces when it comes to taking electricity to rural communities that may not actually want it in the first place. And then the technical assistance that REA offers to some of these developers. You could bring PowerGen and you'd know that they have the capacity to deploy these things, but you also have local developers who struggle to even understand what the sector produces and how they can compete. So yes, we do regulations, we do grants and loans, and very, very affordable loans for developers, and we also provide technical assistance to handhold these local developers. And this is big because the industry is very nascent in nature, and they deserve to be carried along the whole way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's really interesting. And once again, I applaud, as I'm sure many others do, the work of REA. Now, I'm really interested to hear a little bit about some of the projects that you've got coming down the pipeline, particularly around this agricultural energy nexus, because I know that REA take this very seriously, and I understand that you are about to launch a program called Energizing Agriculture. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit into that, particularly with regards to value chains and how you're selecting what these points of interface between agriculture and energy might most usefully be. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So yes, energizing agriculture, like I said earlier, you take electricity to communities is one thing, but then their willingness to pay, their ability to pay is something that even the private developers are really, really keen about. So we started to look towards how can we improve the economic lives of these people in this community so that the mini grids that you take to them and other solar systems that you take to them can be affordable to them. And that's where we looked at Energizing Agriculture program, because in Nigeria, and you would agree with me that most African countries, the chief activity that you would see in most rural communities is agriculture. Yes, there's some trading, there's some other trades in those communities, but it's mainly agriculture. So we looked at how we can go into these communities and energize agriculture. And from the comments made by Sam and Richards earlier, it's about bringing electricity and agriculture nexus together to say, what can we do to put in these two efforts together? The first one is we looked at the barriers. What are the key barriers that hamper putting this to having that nexus in electricity and agriculture? And we came up with lack of collaboration. We came up with lack of vetted equipment that you could take to these communities and plug to these mini grids. You talk about lack of awareness of use cases and we have objectives and some key components that would drive our program. And one of them is the intersector scaling. If the Central Bank of Nigeria would provide loans for developers or for farmers to key into agriculture, and REA would come with this kind of business models and say, okay, you've deployed diesel generators in these communities where there is massive processing. How about we bring a mini grid to replace that diesel generator? It would be more affordable for this community to pay the tariff for the use of this equipment. It would be more efficient for the developer, it would be more available and more clean in that sense. And that's what we're hoping to do. We've started stakeholder conversations. We've started to talk to commodity forums. We've spoken to Farmers Association, and they will tell us that we have 1,000 hectares of farmlands that require irrigation systems. And instead of doing small standalone systems, we can all cluster them together and provide a large mini grid that would power irrigation systems for those communities and those farms in those communities. And so we do the same thing with processing, we do the same thing with storage and cold storages and so on and so forth. So we're looking at integrating a complementary effort with what the programs that have already been put in place. And we're also looking to do accelerator projects. And all these efforts are things that we've worked with Rocky Mountain Institute to come with, to identify these barriers, to come up with these objectives and then the components. And we're set to begin very soon to see how we can do the implementation. And you mentioned Rockefeller Foundation, they're really keen on seeing how they can plug in their finances and see that we've demonstrated some of these pilots and then we can talk about scaling them on a nationwide scale.
That's really interesting, Mohammed. I'm curious that the question begs itself. Is there any interest nationally from the agriculture ministries and from national agencies which are dealing with agriculture? Do you have many points of contact with them? And indeed, have there been any conversations that have brought you all around the table? Or is that something you plan to do?
Yes, we've started engagement with key personalities within the ministries of agriculture, ministries of water resources. We've engaged with programs such as the Appeals Project. There are local programs in states, the agricultural development programs, and this is to complement the efforts that they have. And one key important thing for us is having data. And that's something, a tradition that we have in RE, to know the communities, to know what they produce, to know where the struggle is. Some challenges come within that value chain of processing, where they are able to produce a lot of produces, but they're not able to process it, and the loss comes from processing. And we would know exactly that after verification, we're going to plug into that processing aspect of the value chain. And in some other places, all they require is just some irrigation systems to boost their production. And so yes, we've engaged some key ministries and state governments and other programs like the Appeals and the Fadama projects in Nigeria. And we're trying to compile a list and come up at the end of the day with a pipeline of projects that are quick win for us, where you either just put in a mini grid to power them, or you bring in processing equipment to utilize the mini grids that have been put in place already.
Mohammed, that's really, really interesting. And I think you mentioned something very key there, which is data. Now, that's something that we found time and time again, and actually had to gather a lot of our data through surveys and work actually in the country. But without that data, it was very difficult to quantify which of the processes along a value chain were the most important to invest in. And that was a function both on how much energy they used, but also how much value they added to the agricultural output. All of that quantification and all of that ability to compare processes along value chains and even between value chains started off with data. So I'm really, really interested and really excited to hear that you guys are actually looking at using that data as a backbone for prioritizing that kind of investment. And if you haven't already, I definitely hope that there might be something relevant in the report for that kind of undertaking. Thank you, Mohammed. Now, I think what you've described so well is how creating a national level enabling environment with the use of policies and support programs and technical assistance really is the foundation stone for building a flourishing and enabling environment for these kind of projects. But I'd like to hear a little bit now from rather than the top down, a little bit from the bottom up, from the actual communities themselves. And we know that the most crucial determinant of an enabling environment for a mini grid at the local level is the local ability to pay for energy services. And as we've discussed already, the users that contribute most to mini grid revenues are commercial users, as they're generally the most significant energy off-takers. So it follows that any efforts to boost local businesses will create a more resilient enabling environment mini grids to flourish locally. Now, Samit, first of all, thank you for joining the call. I understand that Smart Power India have been exploring exactly this, working with mini grid developers to boost local businesses on their grids. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how you are providing certain interventions to create a kind of flourishing, enabling environment for businesses specifically on existing mini grid sites. Oh, Samit, are you with us? Whilst we wait for Samit, I was wondering, Richard, do you know a little bit more about this? I know a little bit about their work. Does it make sense to try and describe a little bit about what you know from the micro loans and such like that SPI are working on in India?
Yes, Sam. I think what I can do while Samit is, I know Samit's been having some technical problems joining today. What I can do is perhaps jump to some of the key pieces of work and case studies perhaps that Smart Power India have been involved in, which have been hugely inspirational to us in Myanmar as well. But what I'm going to do is maybe start with some of the impact that they've been able to register in recent years, which I think is going to be particularly interesting to people. What they've been doing is investing and working directly with mini grid developers on a variety of different productive use initiatives, including a water plant, and the sort of case studies that I think really exemplify the kind of work that they've been doing has been investments in a water plant, which actually I've been lucky enough to visit myself. And they've also done quite a lot of work with things like carpentry, multiple carpentry workshops and those sorts of productive uses. What they've been very diligent about doing at Smart Power India has been trying to track the impact. So what they've been able to do through their assessments being conducted by Sambodhi, who they've been using for some of their research in India, has been that the investments have resulted in something like $18.5 increase in per capita income per year. So that's their sort of local GDP increase metric. So they've got a demonstrable, they're seeing a demonstrable increase in income. That may not seem like a huge amount of money, but it is a consistently increasing number, and that's the that's the foundation that they've been building on. But they've also been looking at the impact on their programs on women and children. They've been looking at studying. They've been looking at the reduction in fire accidents due to kerosene lamps usage, for example. So they've seen an almost 70% decrease in that. But electricity consumption, which is something that's obviously of critical interest to all of us, they've seen a massive 460% increase, which is somewhere between 0.5 and 2.8 kilowatt hour increase in the enterprises that they've been studying. So that's those are the kind of results that obviously have given them a great deal of confidence to continue investing in this space or seeking ways in which to grow productive uses. Promotion of energy efficient devices has also seen a significant increase. I think they've now got more than 5,000 households using energy efficient devices. And of course, in their programs in India, what they're seeing, particularly with businesses, is they're not just seeing a complete switch from either no electricity or grid electricity to off-grid electricity. They actually, many of their enterprises are in fact using both grid electricity and mini grid electricity, which has been one of the most interesting developments there. And the reason being, of course, that although in many cases the mini grid tariffs are still a bit higher than the grid, they're 24/7 and they're reliable. So this is a reliable source of power, and it's helped encourage households as well as businesses to use more energy efficient devices. Again, I don't have all of the details at my fingertips because, of course, I'm speaking on behalf of Samit here. They've also been looking at, of course, reduction in carbon emissions and the results from their particular initiatives, like the Safe Water and the drinking water enterprise that they've been investing in. And that's they've now got 42 water treatment units up and running, and that's impacting the lives of about 8,500 people. So I think what you're seeing through their work is a growing body of knowledge, a growing, a much larger petri dish, if you like, of different types of initiatives that are starting to produce results. They're working through some of the early problems that they had. And of course, from what we know of the private mini grid companies that they're working with, is that these initiatives are having a demonstrable impact on their bottom line, which is, of course, what everybody wants to see, is that this helps the mini grid developers become more viable, more profitable, within the context of obviously providing social good at the same time, but working with real enterprises. So I'm just going to pause there, Sam, and see whether you've had any luck getting Samit back, or whether you have any particular questions you'd like to probe on.
But thanks, Richard. We're still trying to get Samit online, and he hasn't been able to unmute, unfortunately. But I think from what I'm hearing from him, he's telling me that you've done an excellent job. So Samit, sorry, you can probably hear us but not contribute. But Richard, I wanted to let's carry on rolling on, because I think you brought up a very interesting point, which is this idea that by supporting entrepreneurs and by supporting businesses on a mini grid, as Smart Power in this India are demonstrating, you're creating less of effectively an off-taker risk for the mini grid developer themselves. And so the mini grid developer's business model is helped, it's more resilient, and their kind of economics are more viable as a result of a diversity of businesses within the community also being supported and generating their own income, therefore providing more of an ability to pay for energy services. And it's this off-taker risk that I'd love to explore in a little bit more detail. So far, we've been talking about this very much from the perspective of mini grids, where the commercial off-takers are these small entrepreneurs. But the same logic also applies for large off-takers. And this will be familiar to those of you who've read the report. But one of the most interesting findings that came out of our research was the scale of the commercial opportunity for what we called captive power at the grid edge. And let me explain that a little bit more. Investing in a rice threshing machine in the community can make sense because the machines are relatively affordable, and threshing is a very useful process to undertake relatively close to where the rice is grown. Even here, however, choosing between two villages, it makes more sense to select one that is relatively centrally located amongst a cluster of rice producing villages, so that the rice from the surrounding communities can be aggregated and processed together. It's simple economies of scale. But as machines get more expensive and get capable of much higher throughputs, it makes less sense to install them at a village level, but rather downstream in small towns where agricultural produce is aggregated from a much wider area. Now, some equipment like cotton yarn spinning machines generally only make sense quite far downstream when they can be run on the national grid. The problem is, in places like Myanmar, however, is that the grid in these areas is very unreliable. And this means that machines can often sit idle for hours every single day. And this is obviously terrible for the economics of the factory, but it spells out an excellent commercial opportunity for an energy service provider that can fill the gaps of this intermittent energy supply and keep the machines humming. Now, which companies are the most experienced at providing energy services in difficult contexts? Well, of course, mini grid developers are pretty well suited to this. And we're really lucky today to have one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest mini grid developer, PowerGen, represented on the call. Alastair Smith is one of the founders of PowerGen. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you about the simple metrics that you use to track if your business or if a particular site is viable, what the kind of enabling conditions are for that to be the case. But also, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how this business model innovation, or this kind of diversification of your business model, moving slightly into the weak grid, the grid edge, the CNI space, whether that makes sense to your business or not. Al, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thanks, Sam, and pleasure to be here. And I think in Nigeria, where we're currently, or where I'm currently based right now, and where we're currently operating, I think what has been very helpful is, as you already stated, is the enabling environment that the REA has provided. That, and then when we look at the communities that we're seeing throughout Nigeria, that there are a lot of different types and different demographics. One of them being around agriculture. And I think it's what we've seen in the deployment of our first 7 sites in Nigeria is that most of the villages are agriculture based. So there's the primary source of income that we are receiving there. And although that is good there's a lot of, what that means is that there's a lot of seasonality with payments, because agriculture is their primary source of livelihood. They focus their capital when it comes to planting season on agriculture, not actually electricity. So we've seen some significant dips in spending on electricity during those planting seasons, which has made it so that the economics that we see in these communities are not where we would want them to be. That being said, we've also done some initiatives around supporting milling and threshing machines to help with the processing of agricultural produce. Now, because during some points of the year that can be very beneficial, during other points it's not as beneficial and that's primarily around harvesting season. So I think as we've sort of talked about before, looking at continued agriculture initiatives that can also help the costs for the farmers, but also increase the wallet that they might have. And I think we've looked at a couple of different things around water pumping and other sustainable farming practices that increase yield, that way could increase their GDP, which was, I know Richard was talking about on behalf of SPI earlier. With that in mind, I think because of some of the lower and seasonality aspects of the rural mini grids that we're being developed, we're also looking at these undergrid areas and more urban context to marry our rural grid initiatives. What we see from that, as you mentioned, is that there is more commerciality to those grids. So we see that the average revenue per user, which is one of the baseline points that we utilize in measuring sites, is significantly higher in more urban contexts. And part of that is because there is more commercial businesses and that there is more dispensable income to spend on electricity to people that have that income but don't currently have reliable electricity. Right now we are looking at a interconnected project that will be launching in the first quarter of next year, which will be an interconnected mini grid. And what we see from that is that a lot of users within that community, they only currently get power for about 6 hours a week. And so that intermittency is very harmful for the commercial businesses the most, because they're required to run larger scale diesel generators in order to operate their business. Whereas when we can come in, we can then reduce their cost of electricity, and so improve their economics, but they're already an established business that is spending more money on electricity. Now you couple that with the people in those communities that have more dispensable income typically than rural villages, that also would enables us to have a higher ARPU from the customers and from that site exactly. Now, we still very much value the rural customers, and we still very much see that there is a huge opportunity to be deploying that. I think as we develop, the best way for us as a business to continue operations is obviously showing good returns and showing good performance from our grid assets. And so by being able to partner some more undergrid or more urban context areas, then that will help our economics as a portfolio in Nigeria, and then also be able to support some of the more rural communities that might have a lower average revenue per user than what we're seeing from a more urban context. Now, I think what we've also seen is that every community is different. So there are rural communities in Nigeria that are predominantly based off of agriculture that do have ARPUs that are within a range of that meet our economic standards, and we do continue to plan and build those out. But there is some variability and less certainty around those because of some of the things that I brought up earlier around seasonality and the dispensable income. So it is something that we're very excited about. And I think with the urban context, we will be deploying that, as I said, in Q1 of next year. And so it'll be great to at least have the comparison between the economics of the two, and then continue to build those out in 2022 and beyond.
Oh, that's really, really interesting, not least of all because if I'm hearing you right, you're describing something which flies slightly counter to what the paradigm in the energy access sector is. A lot of people will say that mini grids are only viable at a distance where it's beyond grid extension zone. So beyond a point where it's more affordable to extend the grid. But what you're saying is that there actually is a business case, not only within the zone where it might be more affordable or it might be cost effective to extend the grid, but actually in through that zone into the grid area and actually run a suitable business model for yourselves in a grid connected place. And not just a business model that's good for you guys, but also a project which is really good for local entrepreneurs. Now, the key piece there, which I think is missing from the standard paradigm, is that about grid intermittency. Now, you mentioned that one advantage that mini grids have is this performance. You're able to offer pretty much uninterrupted energy services. And it seems like the grid edge areas that you're describing might be suitable are areas where there is this intermittency element. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but it definitely flies in the face of a lot of the common rhetoric. But it seems like that's also very much a function of an enabling environment with regards to policy, the actual fact that you can be operating under the actual grid. And I know Nigeria is quite unusual in that way. Do you see that model being applicable elsewhere beyond Nigeria?
I think it is applicable. It all depends on who is the incumbent utility provider. I think in Nigeria and in some of the other countries that we've been working in, we look to see what is the openness to the incumbent utility to working with us as a mini grid developer or a distributed energy renewable energy provider, that we could work with them to help improve their service. So, and I think in Nigeria, what's been great in terms of working with the discos is that they need to update their infrastructure. I think part of why you have some of these undergrid areas that are lacking 24 hours of power is because of there's a lack of generation, and B, then there is some issues around their metering platforms where they don't currently do prepaid metering, or they do estimated billing, and so they realize very high losses on their lines. And the same can be true. I know there's some instances in Kenya, and I think especially across the African continent, where the World Bank or other organizations are subsidizing their national utility. Part of that is because they've been incurring, losses, and a lot of that is because of antiquated infrastructure and antiquated technology that is being utilized in their existing utility networks. So for ourselves, what we look to do is work with the discos in Nigeria, because this can also be good for them, is we are then becoming a consistent buyer of electricity from them, as well as embedding generation ourselves. So now we can provide a reliable service to these undergrid communities. The disco still is generating revenue from these communities by the sale of power to us. And then we are bringing in outside investment to help improve the infrastructure and then manage the site.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then you are then responsible for all the downstream customer management, all the revenue collection, et cetera, et cetera. You take that on board, which is ideally what your business is doing in the first place. That makes a lot of sense, Al. I could talk about that all day probably, but actually we have a question from our audience, actually from Samit from Smart Power India, who is curious to know about whether you work with customers or productive users on your grids with any downstream market linkages. I know a couple of mini grid developers have explored that kind of end-to-end market linkage model. I'm thinking about Jumeme and Enensis in Tanzania. Is that something you've explored at all?
It is. It's something that we've started looking and reaching out to different Nigerian agriculture consumers. So when it comes to produce, is being able to line up the communities in which we work with, that they could then have a general off-taker of the produce that they are generating. What that would do is it frees up a lot of their time and effort, so that they're not having to peddle and sell their stuff. That if we can establish a buyer and establish a price with them, then it takes out a lot of time and headache from their side. And then that allows them to focus on farming more. That's still under development. I think that it's something that we're eager to continue fleshing that out, because there is a lot of upside potential.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and upside potential for your customers is also more resilience for you, I suppose. Yeah, yep. Exactly. So we're running very much out of time. I would like to hand over to you, Richard, if you're still with us, and perhaps you can give us some conclusions and wrap us up. It's an hour seems oh so short, but we're almost at the top of it. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sam. Thanks a lot to the speakers as well. I think what really for me is the takeaway today is this notion of delivering at that ag energy nexus requires this kind of halo effect of an enabling environment that's going to both be supportive from a policy perspective, but also identifying ways in which to effectively finance productive use. Mohammed Jibril talked about the possibility of the central bank providing loans, for example, and he talked about some of the barriers that they're trying to overcome. This is exactly the same story that we're seeing in Myanmar and I'm pretty sure in India as well, where simple problems like financial access for improving value chain initiatives is just not there, or it's extremely difficult to obtain. In fact, to the extent in Myanmar where there is so little financial access for agricultural projects or conversion to electric power, that we in fact began our own energy impact fund to try to provide interest-free loans to micro entrepreneurs so that they could kickstart their little businesses and connect into the mini grids. And in so doing, we uncovered lots of other problems with the value chain, including, well, once they'd connected, where did they sell to and how did that value chain work? And the whole chain became then a subject of interest, which is kind of where the Energizing Agriculture research really came from. What I really like about what Alastair was talking about is this idea of the halo effect with their focus on kind of the rural and sort of peri-urban or urban, I guess, enterprises that he was referring to. And by engaging in that space, that was enabling them to become a more viable business at scale, which in turn then assisted with supporting more rural customers. I think embedded there is this recognition that supporting rural enterprises and rural agricultural enterprises is clearly extremely difficult, and it's something I would imagine that many people on this in this webinar are certainly speaking for us in Myanmar, and I know Smart Power India has also experienced this in many different ways over the last several years. It's a very difficult problem to overcome, especially when there's no sort of tangential investment happening in the agricultural space that creates that amplification of what happens when electrification does arrive. So yeah, again, like Sam said, we could go on talking about this topic for a very long time. There's an awful lot more to cover. And we're going to actually try and do justice to that in our last session, which is taking place next week, next Tuesday at the same time. And we do hope that as many of you as possible can join that. It's arguably going to be one of the most interesting sessions where we really get down to what probably everybody's interested in, which is the idea of who pays. So what is going to be happening with the financing in this space? What are financing institutions thinking and doing? How are they planning to overcome this divide between and a desire to get as much distributed rural electrification out there as possible, but at the same time a recognition that value chains are a complex and potentially quite expensive place to work, and without which DRE is going to be a very, very hard vision to attain. So with that, again, thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the speakers, and we very much look forward to seeing you next week.